Today we're going to talk about ableist language. So my name is Missy, or Melissa. I'm a psychologist over at the Counseling Services Office here on campus. And we're talking about this as part of our Cat Chat series. So we do these presentations every Tuesday at 4 on a huge variety of topics. A couple of things before we get started. So one, like I said, it's being recorded. The other piece is there are a few people who've chimed in on Zoom. So for those of you who are on Zoom, if you want to participate, and we really welcome that, but we turned off your ability to actually speak audio, in terms of audio. And so if you want to send in questions or comments or something like that, go ahead and use your chat function. When the presentation is up like this, I can't actually see the chat, so I will do those at the very end of the presentation. So I just want to let the Zoom people know kind of how they can participate. So as we get started, I think it's important for us to talk about kind of what brought us here and to this presentation before we jump into kind of what actually is ableist language and that kind of thing. So I am presenting on this topic because social justice is a really important part of my identity and the work that I do, both with clients and then kind of on a broader level. And so for me, talking about different aspects of our social identities and the impact and how they're impacted by systems of oppression and privilege is something that I think is really important, not only for people's mental health, right, and so that's partly my role as a psychologist, but I think also for living in kind of a more just world, which I also see as part of my job as a psychologist and just member of society. So, come on in.
No.
Oh.
I'm about to clean out this way.
Oh, okay. Never mind. So that's a little bit about what brought me here today and why this is a presentation I'm doing. So next I'd like to hear from all of you, and so I thought I would start, it would be helpful to start with an introduction to each other. I always think it's easier to talk to one person before we talk to a group. So what I'd like you to do is introduce yourself to somebody that you don't know and share one reason you're attending today's presentation and one thing that you're hoping to get out of it. And once we've done a little bit of that, then we'll come back as a big group. So we'll take a minute or two to do that. Okay? And if you're in on Zoom, if you want to just jot these down or think of them yourself, go ahead. Great. So I'm curious, so I joined the two of them, but let's talk a little bit as a group. Who are we? What brought us here? And what are we hoping to learn? Okay.
The reason why I'm here is because I'm an RA over in Baltimore, and one of our things is we have to go
When we're required, is there something that you're hoping to get out of this, or hoping to learn from the topic?
I'm actually not quite sure what Ableist Language really is, a topic that I'm not really familiar with, so it's gonna be really cool to learn something.
Sure. Cool.
Hi, I'm Kathy Joe. I was literally just scrolling through my email on Tuesday today and saw that this was happening. And so
Cool.
so
Thanks. Oh, I know, but they don't know.
I'm Samantha. I am a GTA in biology, and I want to learn how to use correct language when talking about ability and disability, both in my role as a GTA and my life.
I'm Parker. As a career, I want to be a social psychologist, and what I'm really interested in is prejudice. So I want to take a look at
All right. Well, thank you all for sharing. So actually, a lot of what you've named kind of fits with the goals of the presentation, right? So people talked about, I want to be able to define what ableist language is or ableism is. Like, I don't actually know. We're going to talk a little bit about why it's important to talk about ableism. So getting at a little bit of the piece around prejudice. This can be definitely an individual experience, but also a social experience as well, and a social concern as well. We'll talk about examples of ableist language, so what ends up being harmful, even stuff that may seem really benign that we don't even think about as problematic, words we hear and use all the time. And then we'll talk about alternatives, so other things that we can use. And we're actually going to talk a little bit about, like, what do you do if you hear somebody else using ableist language, right? Because there are a whole range of ways to respond to that or not respond to that. And we'll talk just a little bit. The main focus is going to be on language, but there are also other ways that systems and institutions can be ableist, and so we're going to talk just a little bit about that as well. Okay? So this kind of gives us an overview, but I think also captures a lot of what brought you all here. But of course, know that if questions come up, if things aren't clear, if there's more you want to know or talk about, feel free to jump in, raise your hand, check with me at the end, because I want to make sure this is, like, useful for all of you. Okay, so I don't know how to move these little boxes. All right, that was not hard at all. Cool, then it won't cover the slide title anymore. Okay, so some of you have already named, there we go, this question about, like, what is ableism or what is ableist language? So let's just chat a little bit about, like, what your thoughts are and what this could be or what it might be getting at.
Those things that those of us who are able to live and interact, like, on a like we have to build, like, physical abilities, mental abilities, others don't have that we are able to take for granted. We are, I think one of these being kind of normal is an hour, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it has to do with that, like, power structure.
Sure. So she talked about getting at these pieces of, like, the power structure that's in place, kind of the difference between being able, whether it's bodied or mentally or with our minds. Also these pieces of what if you're not those things, and assumptions that might get made. Are there other thoughts people have, things that we want to add? That's a great start. Yeah, Samantha?
I guess I feel like it's relative, so ableism would be when there are assumptions made that are carried out in like policies or language or physical structures that exclude people who don't fit a certain standard, whether that be physical, emotional, or mental. And so I guess it would be defined by the context and who is excluded and what assumptions are made.
Sure.
It wouldn't necessarily always be the same thing.
Sure, there's definitely this piece of contextual factors, right? Who's being excluded, how, what standards we're using, where those come from. There are definitely historical factors that play a role, as well as like who's involved and what their experience of things is. Yeah, I really appreciate that point too. So when we talk about ableism, now this is in the way of that. So what we're looking at, kind of the broad definition which encapsulates what both of you said, is this discrimination or prejudice against people with diverse abilities. So even the word disability is something that people have started to move away from because it implies sort of a defect or dysfunction rather than just bodies that can do or think or feel in different ways. So among some people, there's a movement to say diverse abilities rather than disability, okay? Important piece to know that kind of encapsulates what people have said, right? So discrimination and prejudice are two different things. So prejudice gets at like attitudes based on a person's group membership. Discrimination gets at behaviors towards that individual or group of people based on their group membership, okay? So this can be overt actions or overt systems that are in play. It can also be kind of beliefs and attitudes that come out in really, really subtle ways, sometimes so subtle that the person who's expressing them doesn't even realize they're expressing them, or doesn't intend to actually express anything that's harmful, but that can sometimes be the impact of it. And the attitudes and behaviors, it's important to know, they come from stereotypes about, and people have kind of referenced this, but kind of this discomfort with this idea of what's supposed to be like normal and what's abnormal, right? Or what's kind of the standard and expectation versus what's different from that. So, the flip side of this, so when we talk about ableism, there's a flip side of that coin, as with all kind of isms or forms of oppression. And the flip side of that coin is what we call able-bodied privilege, okay? So any ism has a privilege on the other side of it, or kind of countering it. And so what we're gonna do is actually watch a really short video that I think does a nice job of demonstrating or giving an example of what privilege can be, or what able-bodied privilege can be. So the speaker in this video is actually a speaker. His name's Tim Weiss, and he does a lot of work on racism and social and like race-based privilege, that kind of thing, white privilege. But part of this talk that he gives, I think actually does a nice job of displaying what able-bodied privilege is. So hopefully we're okay on the sound.
Life better than we do. Shocking, radical kind of thought. Okay. Or even more basic, the most basic level to understand what I mean by the privilege of obliviousness. Think about like able-bodied and disabled. I don't even know how I got into this room tonight. And it's not because I have particularly bad short-term memory. I mean, I do have these two little children, and they do suck my brain matter badly. You know, I forget a lot of stuff. But I got a good enough short-term memory. It's not that. It's that I didn't really have to pay attention to how I got in here. I don't remember if there were steps. And now that I'm thinking about it, there weren't, I don't think. But I didn't have to think about that because as an able-bodied person, and let's be honest, we're all only temporarily so. If we live long enough, we'll all probably have some kind of disability or infirmity. But as a temporarily able-bodied person, I had the luxury of not knowing what people with disabilities face in terms of the obstacles, discrimination, mistreatment, barriers to access. I don't have to give thought to like, how long am I going to take to get from this place to this place? If there's a fire, God forbid, how do I get out? These are not things I have to sweat. And the fact that I don't think about them, that doesn't make me a bad person. Doesn't make me intentionally oppressive to the disabled, right? It just means that I have the luxury of having one less thing to think about that gives me a leg up in just about any situation or any setting, because I have one less thing to think about in a hyper-competitive society environment. And if we want to know if disabled folks face obstacles, who are you going to ask? Me? I just told you, I don't even know. I didn't even pay attention to how I got in. If you want to know if disability is an issue for folks who have it, you need to ask them. And then when they tell you, believe them and don't think they're insane. Same.
All right. So, any reactions to hearing this? There is a lot in that 1 minute clip. So what are your thoughts or reactions here?
He brought up the fact that he didn't really have to think twice about how he got to where he was.
Sure.
I'm glad that you brought up the guilt. I think there's a lot of guilt associated with any kind of privilege, white privilege, equal privilege, whatever it is. So sometimes, those of us who recognize it as a privilege, and you feel a sense of guilt that I have it easy in some respects, but it's not your fault that it's that way. So you don't even feel guilty, but building awareness so that you don't make it harder for someone else
Sure.
is kind of cool.
Sure. Yeah. So these pieces of one, and I had a similar reaction to you when I first watched this, which was like, oh my gosh, as an able-bodied person, physically able-bodied right now, there's this piece of like, I really don't think about how I'm going to get places, if I drop my pen, how I'm going to get it, like pick it back up, or who's going to help me do that, how I get into buildings, if there's a fire, how I'm going to get out of buildings. So I think that really resonated with me, this piece of like, oh, okay, sure. As well as the piece around the guilt, right? It's really easy to feel guilty when you start to be aware of, or when somebody just tells you, kind of confronts you about the privilege that maybe you're expressing without even knowing it. But guilt doesn't make you a bad person or intentionally harmful. Or sorry, able-bodied privilege doesn't make you a bad person or intentionally harmful. But it does mean you maybe have one less thing, like he said, to think about, and maybe something that will take you kind of an extra intentional effort to think about for other people. Other reactions people had. Things that stood out. You're smiling. I can't tell if that's the like, please don't call on me. Okay. So I think another piece that's in there that can sometimes be really easily missed is this idea that we are all only currently able-bodied if we're currently able-bodied, right? So if you live long enough, you are likely to encounter some sort of diverse ability, disability. You're also probably likely to encounter or have people in your life whose abilities change significantly. And so even if this doesn't feel like something that's particularly relevant to you right now, it may be something that is in the future. So that kind of leads us into this topic about, like, what's the big deal? Why even talk about this stuff? Okay, actually, I bet if I do that, there we go. Okay, so why even talk about ableism? Why even have a topic on ableist language? So with the groups that you talked with before, let's come up with 2 or 3 reasons that talking about ableism is important. Because it's really easy to not talk about it, not even have to think about it. So why is it important for us to talk about and consider not using ableist language? Okay, so we'll spend 2 or 3 minutes kind of coming up with at least 2 or 3 reasons per group. So what kinds of things were named? Let's just kind of share as a group kind of some of the things that we talked about. And I'll probably repeat them just in case the mic's not picking them up so the Zoom people can hear it too. So.
The right term for ableist towards people. That way, it can be taken as oppressive. Or down, even though God is with us in their way. The expectations are higher than you can achieve in the way that you're expected to achieve it in some.
Sure. Like they might be kind of unreasonable expectations. Sure.
Get you as ableist can be very insensitive and not realize it.
Right.
You're making assumptions about the other person that you're thinking, well, I would be able to do that, so you should be able to do that.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's definitely, when we talk about why I talk about ableism and able-bodied privileges, this piece, if you're not aware, you can do things that are harmful, say words or set up activities, for example, in ways that would be oppressive or exclusive to certain people with different abilities. You might set expectations that are really unreasonable and not be aware of or be insensitive to why that's not a reasonable expectation for like everyone in a classroom, for example, or on a group project or something like that. Yeah. What else? Other thoughts about it? Kind of why we should talk about this? Okay. So you said it's more beneficial to learn not to say something than it is to protect someone for being able to say that. Can you say a little more about kind of what your thinking is behind that, or what brought that thought up?
That as opposed to tell people that toughen up or eliminate the words or
Okay. Sure. So if we take, right, like one example that gets used a lot is the R word, right? So we all know what I'm referring to when I say the R word. Yeah? Okay. Right, so maybe it's easier to get people to stop saying that than to tell people who are targeted by that, oh, just toughen up, like, you'll be fine, they're just words, sticks and stones, break your bones, but they won't actually hurt you. So I think that makes a really nice point as well. And I think sometimes it's really easy to dismiss how powerful words are, particularly if you haven't personally been hurt by them. It can be easy to just be like, brush it off, that's no big deal, it's just words, you know, or even to reason away why the person said it. But the reality is that words do have a pretty profound impact on it. Like, think about the first time somebody you really cared about said something hurtful to you and how deeply that can impact you. So there's that piece, right? The piece where language can be a form of oppression, particularly when we look at sort of the historical context out of which that language was developed or came. It can be dehumanizing, right? So taking away just sort of the human qualities that people have. So that's why we look at things like, rather than saying a disabled person, we put the person first. So a person with a disability or a person with diverse abilities. That's just one way that really doesn't take a lot of effort on the speaker's part to kind of rehumanize or prevent the dehumanizing of someone. Okay. There are also pieces of this where we know, like, people with diverse abilities have much higher rates of poverty, they have much higher rates of unemployment, they're much more likely to be assaulted than the rest of the population. They face widespread exclusion, discrimination, human rights violations. So we also have a lot of evidence that people with diverse abilities are actually treated much worse than currently able-bodied folks are. And that has a profound impact on people's well-being, their physical health, and their mental health. So I think all of those pieces are really important, right? And we talked about the pieces of like, if this isn't personally relevant for you already, it probably will become personally relevant for you at some point in your life in some way or another, okay? So let's jump into kind of the nitty gritty because we haven't really talked about, oh darn, what is ableism? So I gave one example. So what we're going to do for this activity is come up with our own examples of ableism, all right? So these 3 hearts here on the board, which I rough sketched, represent different parts of what it means to be human, okay? So our mental, kind of what's happening for us in our mind, our thinking, that sort of thing, the emotional piece, the feeling part of things, and then physically, right, our physicality. So what our bodies actually look like, how it moves, that sort of thing, okay? So for the first activity, what we're going to do for each one of these is identify the words that we use to describe someone who's sort of normal, right, or what society expects, all right? And the boxes around the hearts are going to help us do that because those boxes represent how we get shaped or how we get taught what things are supposed to be like, what society says they're supposed to be like, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what falls outside of that, okay? So to start off with, what are the words we use to describe somebody who has a normal mind or a normal mental state? Smart. Sane. Reasonable.
Stable.
What's coming to mind? Well, sure. Let's move on to emotional, but if other ones come up for the mental part, we can come back to that. So how about what we use to describe like normal feelings or emotions, or people who are exuding those? Likeable? In control. Sure. Yeah, I think stability can definitely get at the emotional side of things too. Ideas or things. Sometimes I think it helps to think of things in terms of like when I'm not feeling whatever sort of within the standard of what's expected of me in terms of emotions, what do I tell myself I should be doing? Right? So in control definitely comes up a lot, like I'm not in control of my emotions. Calm? Yeah. So let's do the physical one now. So what words do we use to describe bodies that are like what we expect them to be in terms of their physicality? Fit?
Audience, I guess, just
Okay, sure. I'm not sure. happy, maybe? Maybe that fits under emotional and physical, but what was that?
I think that they're all three.
Sure. Anything else we don't have up there that comes to mind in terms of like, this is what's expected?
Happy because when somebody asks you how you're doing, you're expected to say, I'm good. You
Sure.
know, keep a smile on your face.
Sure. So happy. Yeah. Or if not happy, at least maybe fine.
Yeah.
Fine. Do the emotional one? Okay. You looked like you were thinking of something earlier. Okay. All right. Well, let's go on to the next piece of it then. So, what words end up getting, so we're going to kind of switch gears here and talk about what words get used to describe. So, we want to go with adjectives. We're not going to do labels quite yet. We'll do that in a second. Something to look forward to. So, how about the adjectives that get used to describe sort of minds that work in unexpected ways or that get defined as abnormal? Disordered. Unstable. I didn't hear that. Bothered. What about got right? Let's see. Unstable against stable. What about like unreasonable against reasonable? That sometimes gets used against people, right? You're being unreasonable. What's that? The R word. Let's save that one for the label.
Oh, the label? Oh, okay.
Yeah. How about for emotional pieces? Yes. Fantastic. You guess.
Oh, sorry, bipolar label.
Probably. I actually could probably fall into both places, right? Should we hang on to it till the label piece? Okay, we'll hang on to that. Oh, crazy. How about with the physical, kind of, what words do we use to describe sort of the physical side of things that are unexpected? just come up. So then outside of these circles, there's this piece of the names that we call, or the stereotypes that we use for people with disability or diverse abilities in these three categories, right? So we'll just name, kind of in the interest of time, just a couple for each one. And pay attention as we're doing this to the reactions that you're having internally, right? To thinking about these things, saying them out loud, if that brings anything up for you. And if there are different reactions to different words. I think you named the R word. So we have that. What about other names people with different mental abilities get called? What was the last part you said?
Just crazy. I think that's you, and we have it in this circle, but I think like people also just call they're crazy.
Sure.
You know?
Yeah. So
Weird and things,
crazy, weird. How about emotional? We had the bipolar.
Yeah, that whole, yeah.
How about for physical? Purple. Couple that I think use so easily without even thinking about it are the word lame. Like, this test is lame, this class is lame, and blind. And blind is one that gets used in the social justice circles a lot. When people talk about the things that they lack awareness about, right? So someone coming into this presentation could have said, you know, like, I don't know that much about ableism. It's an area of my, blindness. And that ends up using an ableist term to talk about why they're coming to an ableist presentation. So, as we did this, what were some of the reactions that you all had internally as we were coming up with these different adjectives and labels that people get called?
That would be the R word. Kind of as like hit home here recently. I actually have an aunt who just recently had a Down syndrome. And so, throughout the years when I was growing up, I was always wanting to say, but was John my K, I was trying to say that.
Sure. Now there's this real personal connection. Before it was like sort of this exercise. I know I'm not supposed to say that, but it becomes really different when it hits close to home. Sure. Mm-hmm. Other reactions people had as we were doing this? It looks like something's going through your mind. No pressure to share it, though.
Like, we can all admit that we, at some point, used one of these words without even thinking about it, and now that I'm thinking about situations where I've used these words, I just the impact that we've had. It just makes
Sure. So some of that guilt is coming up. Yeah. I appreciate your courage to name that. I think that can be really hard. When the reality is, probably most of us have used, all of us have used at least one thing up here, and probably most of us have used more than one. And
even if we used it with the most innocent of intentions, still,
yeah, for sure. For sure. You don't know who it's impacting or in what ways, how they're connected to those words. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for sharing those reactions. So it feels like a really quick jump to then turn this around. So what do we say and do instead? So in the interest of time, rather than kind of doing this in group and then talking as a whole, I think it's important to be aware of saying what we actually mean. So it's really easy to use a lot of the words up here as like shortcuts, right? Oh my gosh, the weather is so bipolar, right? It's a quick shortcut rather than saying, you know, what else might you use instead of bipolar in that sense?
Back and forth,
Yeah,
up and down.
back and forth, up and down, spotty, unpredictable. And those are things that are different, can be related to this disorder of bipolar disorder, but don't encapsulate it, right? And so it's really a misnomer to use bipolar disorder in that way. So looking at some other examples, some that we've talked about and some we haven't, right? So with the OCD thing, so we threw that up there under the mental side of things. So if someone says, or if you might kind of find yourself being pulled to say, oh my gosh, he is so OCD, what words could you use instead? Particular, precise. Those are great examples. The few I came up with were like meticulous, neat, picky. We talked about the weather has been so bipolar lately. How about crazy? So that was one of our examples, right? So if you're saying like, she's crazy,
Yes, that word gets used so much. We use it so much. So many contexts.
it's
That's a hard
true.
one to avoid.
It's true. It takes a lot of mental energy to catch yourself on anything that you use automatically and then something that is just so embedded and so common, right? And can mean so many different things, right? Like, she's crazy might be referring to she's wild, she's outrageous, unpredictable, like things that you admire in this person, you know, or like kind of have this like envy, I wish I could be more like that. It might also be something that's used to really discredit the person, right? She is so crazy, right? Which might actually get at things like untrustworthy, unpredictable, that sort of thing. So we talked about the R word, right? Using that as a label for other people. What might you use instead if you find yourself that's part of your vernacular? Uncautious? Okay. Maybe if it fits the context. Unsure. You're not paying attention. I think also in this sentence, you might be looking at something that doesn't make any sense, or is silly, or is foolish, right? You also might want to think about just the fact that you're labeling someone something anyway, in the way that can be harmful, even if you're not using oppressive language. But I think also it's important to know, so the R word came from mental retardation, which was a diagnosis that we used to use in medicine and psychology, and actually is not anymore. So when they published the latest kind of book or dictionary of psychological disorders, they took it out and they changed it. So now we use intellectual disability, so it's not even a word used anywhere for like professional or clinical purposes, and part of that was because it was decided that it was used in such harmful ways and had such problematic connotations that we couldn't even keep it in as like a, you know, mental retardation as a diagnosis we give people anymore. So I think that gets at kind of how powerful language really can be. So the lame thing, right? I think this is also when people don't think about, I mean, maybe that word doesn't get used all that often, but it's something that we don't, what'd you say?
I think it's a little bit more 90s.
Kind of 90s. So,
I'm pretty familiar with that word.
so, But I threw it in there as a way to write like these things that we don't even think about. Like we don't typically use lame to describe people's physical abilities that much anymore. And so it may seem like, oh, it's not a big deal to use that word if you were going to. But even that, it's still not precise, right? Like if you're describing like, oh, this class is so lame, maybe you're actually talking about it's like boring or it's lousy or it's uninspiring, which is a very different experience than someone who maybe has trouble or is not able to walk. Okay, so what do you do if you see someone else engaging in something like using the R word? What do you do? So what are your thoughts, kind of now that we've gotten to this point of the conversation? What have you done or what do you want to do? Or what are you afraid of? That's real.
I always think it's like the toughest thing to do is obviously like you can acknowledge something that someone said, but to be able to step up and try to give them a little check, you don't ever want to make anything bigger than what it is, because you don't want to offend that person, or they're starting a ruckus. But in this case.
Yeah, I think it is hard, right? It is hard to confront people when they use language that's problematic, and like primarily because they are not asking you for feedback, right? This is not like a, hey, would you let me know kind of how I'm coming across situation? You're giving them unsolicited feedback, which most of the time people don't really appreciate. Yeah. It brings up guilt, defenses, even amplified if you're like in a group of people. So I provided some examples and we'll watch a quick video on being an ally. I think you can use sarcasm. If you are particularly skilled at sarcasm or humor, go for it. I am not really one of those people, but I very much admire people who use sarcasm well. You can shut it down. If it's your style to just be like, hey, uncool, don't say that, go for it. You could ask them to explain, kind of play like you don't really know what that means, like, okay, like tell me how this test can have a low IQ and have difficulty like doing activities of daily living, right? Because it kind of points out like that's really an inaccurate word for the situation. You can be honest about how that feels, right? Like that hits really close to home. That hurts somebody that I care about and that hurts me. Sometimes if it's a situation where you're like, this is not a place where I can make a confrontation, maybe your professor said something, I think it's fair to make a face, right? And in this group setting, saying something small, making a face, and then talking one-on-one later, when you're not in front of a group of people, can be a much more helpful way than to call somebody out in a group of people, because you're probably just going to get defensiveness. Okay, so this last video, I don't know if you're familiar with Cheska Lee, she's a pretty prominent web presence, but 5 great tips for being an ally. Oh, what? That's a bummer, yeah.
Hey friends! So I'm trying something different with my setup, and I don't know if it's working, but you will deal. Imagine your friend is building a house, and they ask you to help, but you've never built a house before. So it'd probably be a good idea for you to put on some protective gear and listen to the person in charge, otherwise someone's gonna get seriously hurt. Look, I'm helping! It's the exact same idea when it comes to being an ally. An ally is a person that wants to fight for the equality of a marginalized group that they're not a part of. We need your help building this house, but you probably should listen so you know what to do first. Let's do this. So here are my 5 tips for being a good ally. Understand your privilege. Now, a lot of people get hung up on the word privilege, so let me break it down for you nice and easy. Privilege does not mean that you are rich, that you've had an easy life, that everything's been handed to you and you've never had to struggle or work hard. All it means is that there are some things in life that you will not experience or ever have to think about just because of who you are. It's kind of like those horses that have those blinders on. They can see just fine. There's just a whole bunch of stuff on the side that they don't even know exists. So for example, there are currently 29 states where you can legally be fired for being gay, and there are 34 states where you can legally be fired for being trans. Now, as a straight cis woman, those are things that I don't have to ever think about if I don't want to. I'm not going to be fired because I'm straight, and I'm not going to be fired because I am cis. So it makes sense that before I can fight for the rights of others, I have to understand what rights I have and others don't. That's privilege. Listen and do your homework. It sounds like a no-brainer, but it's not possible for you to learn if you aren't willing to listen. So you gotta know when to zippa the lippa. I don't know. You get what I mean. But that's the thing that's so cool about social media. There are so many people sharing their stories all around the world and connecting with people that they normally would never get a chance to without the power of the internet. So do your homework. Start reading blogs, tweets, news articles, and stories so that you can get caught up on the issues that are important to the communities that you want to support. Speak up, but not over. If the Fight for Equality was a girl group, the ally wouldn't be the lead singer or the second lead singer. They'd be Michelle. An ally's job is to support. You want to make sure that you use your privilege and your voice to educate others, but make sure to do it in such a way that does not speak over the community members that you're trying to support or take credit for things that they are already saying. This isn't Mario Kart. Stay in your lane. Realize that you're going to make mistakes and apologize when you do. Nobody's perfect. Unlearning problematic things takes time and work, so you are bound to mess up and trip and fall. But don't worry, you can brush yourself off and get right back up. I'm back up! Just remember that it's not about your intent, it's about your impact. So when you get called out, make sure to listen, apologize, commit to changing your behavior, and move forward. Last but certainly not least, actually the most important thing on this list, is remember that ally is a verb. Saying you're an ally is not enough. You gotta do the work. 1 through 4. 1 through 4. As always, there are links in the video description.
All right. So some nice reminders, I think, about what it takes to be an ally. Some, if you're going to step up and act, some things to keep in mind. And then I just wanted to end on, this recognition that ableism isn't just about the language that we use. So it comes in terms of inaccessibility, physical inaccessibility. So snow removal, If you are in a wheelchair, or maybe even on crutches, having a big lump of snow in front of a building you need to get to is not going to work. Having door knobs instead of levers, so all doors you should be able to get in and out of, as if you didn't have hands or thumbs. But a lot of buildings and a lot of doors, you'll notice, probably have knobs instead, which are impossible to open if you can't use your hand. Inaccessibility of information. So if we don't have Braille and closed captioning, like that video doesn't have closed captioning unless you turn the sound off, So the options here are either to play the sound or show the words, but you can't do both at this point. I think the piece of infantilizing others, it goes with what she was talking about in terms of staying in your lane and don't act for the people in the group that you're trying to empower or trying to be part of their empowerment, So, and that can come in the way of grabbing a door for somebody in a wheelchair. So instead of just acting on it, checking in, hey, do you want me to grab that door? Would it be helpful if I picked up the pen you dropped, or whatever that may be? So people know what they need and what they don't need. So either letting them request it or asking and letting them tell you what they do and don't want from you, I think, is a really important piece of this. And then the last piece about assuming that disability is always visible, So, we talked about the whole mental and emotional state, You don't get to see any of those things. But also things like, maybe you've heard stories of someone who has a parking sticker, And they get out of the car and walk into a building, and they come back and there's a note on their car that's guilting them or giving them some sort of grief about using a handicap sticker or parking space. And so it's important to remember, disorders come in all forms. Psychological, chronic illnesses, developmental disabilities, learning disorders. Sometimes they're short-term, sometimes they're long-term, sometimes we're born with them, sometimes we develop them over time. So I think it's also really important to remember that it's not always what we can see, and it's not always going to be evident, which takes us back to the piece about language. You don't always know who's in the room with you, And so it's not enough to say, oh, I don't use the R word, when I'm around these people, but it's cool the rest of the time, because you really don't even know. So that wraps up Anybody have questions, things that you were hoping for that didn't get resolved today? Things you're still wondering about? Yeah.
I guess I have a question on the word blind,
Sure.
because that has certain very specific uses that are not related to it.
Okay.
Like in science, there's something called a double-blind study, where like neither group knows what's
Sure.
So I know in that case it would probably not be taken as ableist necessarily, but sometimes people will extend that to some kind of metaphor, and that's more of a gray area.
Sure.
What you say is don't use it if you want to.
What do you all think? Like, if there's a word that you're like, I don't know, what should we do? Trust your gut?
A lot of terms like that are an acceptable common language and aren't having for me, long time ever meant to be offensive or ableist. Like maybe when it was first created, it was ableist, but the context, it removed from context.
Mm-hmm.
There probably are some words that are ableist, but most people wouldn't, even people, someone who's blind wouldn't take offense to that being used.
Sure.
They recognize the context of it.
Right. Yeah, I think that there's, with any word, and even some that are up here, and that's a great example, there's this piece of figuring out, so how do I still go through the world and communicate and be able to relax when I'm talking to people, and try not to be harmful in the language I use. So I think part of it is, trusting your gut. If you're doubting, ask somebody, right? There's also this realization that just because you ask, say, one person who is blind or identifies as blind, they may say, no problem with the word double blind. And another person may say, I have a huge problem with that. So I think there's also that piece that was talked about in the video of, if somebody tells you, hey, that was really hurtful, then kind of being able to own in that moment, oh, okay, thanks for letting me know, I'll try not to use it. So I think there's both. Doing what you can to reduce the harmful language you use, and then also recognize you are gonna blunder. You're gonna make mistakes. We all do it. You're gonna use the word crazy again, probably, right? And then just acknowledging when it happens, oh yeah, trying not to use that word. Or oh yeah, I totally, thanks for letting me know that use of the word blind is hurtful.
You're right. It depends a lot on the individual, because I have friends who want to be called that because of the there's and I'm not going to remember who wants to be called what all the time. So you just know you're going to, occasionally you might upset someone, but yeah, accepting, owning it, and saying, yeah, no, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I think everything is besides valid. My mom is deaf, and so I've grown up being around that. And that's really a culture kind of, I guess, because I live in Olathe, Kansas, and that's where Kansas School of Deaf is. And so there's a big community of deaf people. And it went from deaf was a bad thing to call someone, you want to call them hard of hearing, back to they want to be called deaf, and hard of hearing isn't a thing, or hearing impaired isn't a thing, and so it changes all the time, and I think most people are really understanding, at least the deaf people that I know are really, really understanding, this changes all the time, I understand that people are confused. All my mom does is when someone gets it wrong, she just corrects them and says, yeah, it's just what we say now. She never gets really offended by it or anything. So I think most people who come across will be very tolerant of people not being aware of what the current thing is, especially if it's emerging.
Which is super gracious, right, on her part, and that I think can take a lot of effort if you're encountering it over and over. So So you may get varying responses. Hopefully people are gentle when they give feedback. They may not be. I think it's also important to remember the difference between intentions and impact. Probably most of us have good intentions. Most other people have good intentions. And that doesn't mean that it always hits people in ways that feel good. And so I think kind of knowing that, keeping that in mind for yourself, like, I'm still a good person and I still had good intentions, even though what I did was hurtful. It's like stepping on somebody's foot, right? You didn't mean to, but it still hurts. So you own, like, oh gosh, I'm so sorry that I did that. Anything I can do to, like, help make it better right now? And then kind of move on and continue to try not to step on people's feet, but know it's going to happen sometimes. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming and participating. I really appreciate it. If you have questions or anything else, we can chat individually afterwards. So thank you. And